Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you guys for joining us today in the second installment of our webinar series. Just as an administrative note, Jose and I did a webinar back in October centered on budget design and process. If anybody missed that, wanted to follow up or discuss that, please reach out to either of us. But we're here today to talk about org design and unlocking current value and scaling growth for a healthy organization. We're going to start off with some quick introductions. I'm going to let Jose start us off, and then I'll go and get into our materials. So, Jose.
Appreciate it, Craig. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Have a really cool topic to discuss. Brief intro on my end. To begin with, I'm one of the founding partners of Impact Point. Before I started Impact Point, I spent 10 years at Alvarez & Marsal, 3 years at BCG, where we did multiple transformations with significant time spent on the org side as well. And so that's some of the learnings that we plan to share with you and some of the best practices today. It's some of those learnings apply to the middle market. Correct?
Yeah, thanks, Jose. Hi, I'm Craig Harworth. I'm a partner with Impact Point and co-lead the Office of CFO practice with Jose. Similar, I have about 10 years of experience with Alvarez, a couple more with both BDO and PwC, and then also bring a little bit of a different perspective to this topic, as well as I've held leadership positions within organizations and have done the org design both as a consulting engagement type process as well as internal. So with that, let's jump over to the agenda. We just covered off our speaker introductions, but today we're going to cover when you should think about considering an org design, and we'll go through a sample engagement to show you before and after and some of the results, and walk you through some scenarios when it might click with you to undertake an org design process. Next, we'll get into the benefits that an organization would enjoy from doing one of these processes, both the qualitative and quantitative side of it. Next, we'll jump into the IPC approach, which is a little bit different than I think a lot of people have experienced in the past. Traditionally, this has been a 12-month type process that's very disruptive to the organization. IPC drives a metric-driven, quick hit type of assessment and implementation. The entire process takes about 6 to 12 weeks, and minimal disruption to the organization. We'll take you through that process as well. We'll talk about a free assessment that, by virtue of joining us today, that you have an opportunity to enjoy with Impact Point, and Jose will walk you through that. So as an administrative note, is we're going through the presentation. If there are some questions that you would like us to address or topics to cover, please send those in via the chat function, and we will try to allow for time at the end to cover those off, or we can also follow up with you individually. So with that, let's jump into the materials on when you should consider an org design. And as I mentioned, I was going to start off with an example of a before and after, and this is a sample engagement that we did execute on. This illustration is based on a functional unit, but we did do the design for the entire organization, and I'll talk about those pieces as it pertains to the entire organization in a minute. But as you look at the top of the screen here, you see the colors all represent functionality. There's a lot of mismatch. There's a lot of shuffling within the organization. And it's just not clean. The spans of control are low at 3, and there's 5 layers in this organization. And if you think about the boxes representing a head count, this is a pretty small organization, and 5 layers is too many for this organization. Jumping down to the bottom section, you really see the cleaned up version. And the roles are aligned. There's clarity in how the work gets done. There is alignment around the functionality. There's a simplified management structure. We don't see individual contributors. It is a really clean, healthy organization. And this really facilitates efficiencies, value creation, and how the organization delivers on strategy. If you look over on the left-hand side, the top part there is for this function, we achieve a 12% cost savings. And as you think about value creation, that is a significant impact to the bottom line. And then if you take that out at your 10, your 15 times EBITDA multiple, you really see how this type of a project can drive significant value to your organization. And over on the left-hand side, closing this one out, we can talk about some of the benefits here in this specific example. Again, 12% for this function. The overall organization, it was almost 10% of a headcount cost reduction. There was significant middle management duplication here. And so we went in and looked at that. And as we cleaned up that span of control, there was a lot of benefit from that, removing some of that middle management structure. And that also helps with the efficiencies of communication strategy and driving the ways of working within the organization. The individual contributors went away. You also see the span of control was increased, and no manager had a span of less than 4. We have clarity of role and function. And one side note here as well, as we approached this entity, they had already previously performed 2 reduction in forces. And so we were still able to go in and working with the team, again, across the organization, achieve that 10% reduction and across the organization. So still had a significant benefit, both in the qualitative and quantitative result for this organization. So I want to transition a little bit now to pain points that we hear from clients. And looking through these, hopefully some of these will resonate with you. They sound familiar to you. But starting at the top here, one of the complaints that we get is the process takes too long. People don't want to spend 12 plus months to see results. And so what we have developed is able to deploy a metrics-driven, data-driven process that is a sprint type of engagement and able to deliver the full results in 6 to 12 weeks. Again, that's significantly different than a legacy that you would see. And there's some other themes that you'll see through here as far as we haven't done this before, that we don't have a standardized approach. Each person is responsible for doing their own type of reorganization and managing their structure, or we don't have the expertise. So the approach that I'm going to take you through, the impact point approach I'm going to take you through here in a few minutes, is designed to significantly alleviate or completely remove these pain points for you. So let's talk about when you should think about considering an org design process. And I think a lot of people approach org design or specifically reductions as a cost savings mechanism. It's typically a time period where there's a restructuring going on. There's a goal to take out a certain percentage of cost and improve liquidity or EBITDA. And so that's really the legacy way of approaching an org design. But I want to talk to you about some of the areas where there could be significant benefit and other time periods that you should be doing that. One of them is, I think the PE world operates in very much the acquisition type environment, the platform plus unintegrated acquisitions, the bolt-on types. So as you're going through a quick pace of acquisitions, or it's been a while since you've done a full integration, you end up with a lot of these shadow organizations, and maybe the acquired acquisition has finance function, it has HR function. And so you start to see a lot of that duplication, shadow organizations across the organization. It leads to inefficiency, a lack of clarity of how work gets done, who is supposed to be owning certain processes. And so that's an ideal time to do an org design process. Next case is for M&A planning. And by this, I don't mean like the bolt-on type acquisitions. It's typically when you're thinking about a material acquisition, that there's significant headcount involved. It would be an ideal time to get ahead of that. That would help increase the speed in which you can realize the savings, the synergies, and get down the investment thesis much quicker than leaving that to post-acquisition. In our last webinar, we talked about doing an org design during the budget process, which is an ideal time to do it as you're doing that once a year look at truly what is your budget or a 3 or 5 year strategic plan. But it's also a good process to think about as you're doing your rolling forecast, as you're either looking to close the gap to budget, doing your periodic reforecast, or if you're looking to overachieve where you are versus the budget, another good time. The fourth I hit on a little bit earlier, but if you're going through a reorganization, if your operating model is changing, if you're reorganizing legal entity structure and moving pieces around, another ideal time to take a look. And the number five here, it's the last true instance, but 18 to 24 months before your next investment type of horizon, as you prepare for exit, doing that time period allows you to take a very measured approach, think about, and I'll talk in a minute, there can be stages in which you're implementing these org design changes, but 18 to 24 months allows you to plan, implement, remove any gating items, and have a proof of concept that really resonates with the next buyer and increases and maximizes your enterprise value. And the last piece, while I said number five was the last one, number six is more of a change in culture and a thought. Once you go through an org design process, it should really be part of your ongoing culture and mindset. We've had a lot of clients that do dashboards and monitor the design metrics during their either quarterly or monthly operating reviews, make those tweaks and making sure that they're in compliance with their design principles on a regular basis. And so it really should develop a new culture and mindset as you're going through and thinking about this. So next, we're going to jump into some benefits of an org design. We've talked about when to consider, and now we're going to bring in some scenarios, some terminology, and talk about some of the benefits of org design. So if you look at the left-hand side of the top structure here, you'll see a diamond shape. And one of the things that we want to talk about is, that's indicative of an inefficient organization. There's too many layers in this organization. There's probably not defined roles and responsibility, and the ways of working is not defined. As we look at that pre-org design, there's 9 layers. So you see 1 through 9, that starts with the CEO and goes down to the lowest layer of the organization. The gray bars represent the number of individual contributors in each layer of the organization, and the blue bars indicate the management layers within the organization. So on the left-hand side, again, you have this inefficient design. And as you think about the redesign and getting to that pyramid, which is the ideal shape on the right-hand side, you're creating a lot of simplification, a lot of clarity, and again, that value creation. Excuse me. And on the below, you'll see some ranges of possibilities that we've experienced in these types of engagements. So headcount cost, 5 to 20% reduction in the cost, reducing layers, which increases that simplicity and efficiency. The FTE headcount, reducing 5 to 15%. And if you'll notice, that number is lower than the top end of the headcount cost. So back to my comment earlier about reduction in middle management and upper levels, that's really showing up in that metric. And then your median spans increasing with more of a focus on geo-focused centers. On the right-hand side here, you'll see, again, some of the benefits. And the enterprise value, I think, is self-explanatory, but you'll really maximize the value for that cost takeout piece of it. You're able to more quickly respond to changes in the competitive environment, market conditions, changing of strategic focus, and your go-to-market strategy. You have an integrated platform that people understand. It's clear within the organization, which translates into a clear operating model. And as I mentioned previously, it's really a tactical deployment of our approach in that it's minimally invasive. We do a sprint methodology that allows most of the work to be done in those meetings. So talking about different states of org design and what those models look like. You see three samples here, and really the ends of it, the baseline and the future state, are kind of a now and where you want to be. And so as you move across from left to right, you're increasing health, efficiency, the qualitative benefits as well as the quantitative benefits of org design, and really setting up the organization to have the growth capacity for both acquisition or organic enabled growth. But if you look on the left-hand side, this may be something that resonates with a number of you and is familiar. Maybe it's an inherited organization, that it's a baseline organization that you came into. There were a lot of unintegrated add-ons taking place that resulted in shadow organizations. The operating model is confusing. People are not clear on what their role is and how their role translates into the strategic direction of the company and the overall goals. And again, with those pieces of it are negatives, and then the largest is a dollar impact is with that duplication, with the excess workforce that you're carrying, you're draining enterprise valuation. So let's jump over to the right side now and talk about the future state. So you've gone through a full redesign, you've reset your operating model, you're lean, you're scaled for growth, and this is your ideal scenario. And again, this is something that's not static. You should be monitoring it over time and looking ways for constant improvement. But once you have that operating model, it should really be able to facilitate your organization for the next kind of 3 to 5 years. And a lot of the positive characteristics that we've been talking about there. In the middle section here, it's really if there are some gating items that are keeping you from getting the full future state enabled. And if you think about what those gating items might be, one of the ones that we hear regularly is institutional knowledge. So someone has institutional knowledge and therefore they would be removed but for that institutional knowledge. Or we want a geo strategy, but we have no geo capability at the moment. So those are two examples that are very common. That's not to say that you can stay in that center section, the platform reset. You should be able to do 80% of the design plus, get to that platform reset, have a good understanding of what those gating items are with a clear path, including timeline to address those. And so if it's the geo strategy, maybe you're setting up operations, and in the next 6 to 12 months, you're going to have 5% outsource. As you build that capability, your end goal is 30%, but you have the timeline there to outline what that end state looks like. So now we're going to jump into the IPC approach, how we go about implementing this process and some of the keys for it. So as you look at this chart, I want to introduce a term called a pod. And so we use what we call a pod and sprint methodology. The sprint is the timing, and I'll get into that in just a moment. The pod is really the basis for the design. A pod relates to a business unit or a functional unit, and is one of the key units within the organization. So think about your finance, your IT, or if you have business units, what are those P&L type of business units? The pod leader is typically the head of that function or business unit. So just taking finance as an example, your pod leader is likely your CFO, and that CFO would then pick two to three people to have him or her help design that pod organization. And so they're typically people that are intimately familiar with the organization, know the people, how the work gets done within the organization. And so again, using the finance example, that's potentially like a controller, your head of FP&A, head of treasury type of people. And let's take a second and go around to the spokes here for a moment. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, we can talk about the inside-out diagnostics. And as I've said, IPC's approach is heavily metric and data-driven and technology enabled for the process. And so the diagnostics are really the starting point, and a starting point for the organization, starting a point for the business unit, the function, and it allows that top level view, but also the deep level dives into each of the organizations. it really sets up what you're looking at and helps you start to identify those opportunities. It needs to be agreed upon by HR and finance and the people that are the end users, because you really want a single source of truth. A lot of times we'll see an HR system that may have different total comp than a finance system. So that's where you really come together, align on what those starting points are. Excuse me. The upper portion in the center there is best in class org design tools. And we use a technology-enabled solution called OrgView. It's a very powerful tool, and we found it to work very well in the sprint environment where a lot of the work is getting done in that sprint type of setting. It is a real-time visualization tool. So if you think about the metrics and the data from the inside out diagnostics, that becomes the feeder for OrgView. We're able to look at organizational views real time. We look at different metrics around total cost, levels, geographic location, salary levels. And we can also do real-time adjustments to that. So if we want to up-level a person, if you want to drag somebody out of the organization, redo the boxes, it facilitates that very well. And we found it to be a fantastic tool to use. Moving to the right side in the upper right corner, this is a process that is battle tested. We've implemented this in the PE world a number of times. And again, we use that sprint methodology where you're thinking about a very short process. You might have an hour and a half, 2 hour meeting once or twice a week for each of the pods. And that's where the work is getting done. So you'll see kind of the inset there is a sample timeline, and it includes each of the key components of that sprint. And you'll see that it's broken down into phases. So each phase has its deliverables. The triangles are checkpoints with the steering committee and the CEO. And we run that concurrently using our resources plus internal resources. Jumping back over to the left-hand side of the page, the outside-in benchmarks. Each organization is unique, and we really like to go in and see what the appropriate metrics are for each organization. But benchmarks do have their place in the org design process. If you think about certain industry peers, those might provide those insights and opportunities to something that you're missing. So is there an area that you're just way off against your benchmark group? That could provide us some opportunities to go do some deeper dives. The expert inputs is what IPC brings to the table. So we bring the staffing, the expertise to really drive the process for you. We have the appropriate levels, everybody from partner down to senior associate involved in these processes to drive the overall success of the process. And lastly, the client experts is coming from the company. And we already talked about the pod in the center there, but if you think about who should make up the design teams, it's really the customers of the unit. So if you're thinking again about the finance example, maybe it's a business unit leader who heavily relies on finance for the FP&A piece, the budgeting, the forecasting, treasury, cash management. We'd also bring in people that are peers or partners. So if there's high collaboration areas where it's not a customer, it's not a user, but it's more of a collaborator, those tend to be good pod designers as well. And then the final piece of each of the pods is the support structure, and that would be what I typically think of as the business partners, the finance business partners, legal, and your HR business partners. So now we're going to talk about the key elements to consider when scaling an organization, and it's really the whys, the whats, and the hows. And so the whys we've talked about it. That's just mainly the benefits of doing an org design. The middle section here is where I want to spend most of my time on this slide. And it really thinks about the operating model. And again, operating model, just so we're all on the same page, operating model is how the work gets done. What's the rule clarity? Is everybody aligned as far as what their role is, what their responsibility is, who owns what, how are they getting measured. So when we think about how the work gets done, that's what we mean with that operating model. And so now let's go around the wheel and touch on each of these briefly. Starting at the top, it's the P&L based accountabilities, and this is really the reporting structures. And so if you think about how the organization is laid out from a reporting or legal entity, you likely have your business units and the support functions there. So making sure that those are aligned as far as the P&L, and that really helps with the reporting structure. You want the single point of reporting. It's not to say that you can't support and get input from other parts of the organization. So you can certainly have a finance person that reports into the CFO, but supports multiple business units. But you really want that one reporting structure piece at the end of the day, and that clarifies it for employees' minds as well. Moving to the right around the circle, the roles alignment. Each person should really have a very clear understanding of what their role is, how that plays into the strategy goals of the organization, and how they're going to be measured as far as delivering on those. So if you think about them delivering on certain things, what are those measurements as they are doing their job? How are they delivering in the overall organizational goals? Moving to the bottom right, talent management. This is really helping the employees understand where they fit. So, the talent assessment, where are they doing well, where are they not? The core needs for improvement. What's their path? And do you have the right talent in the right boxes? And the boxes is an important concept that we'll talk about just in just a moment here. But it's making sure that that talent management is aligned with the overall org design and structure. An area that we haven't hit on yet is the processes and systems. And if you think about operating model being, people, processes, technology, this technology piece can be a very good driver of efficiencies, or it can drive a lot of inefficiencies. If you have multiple people that are having to do manual processes because you don't have the right technology enabled within the organization, it can, again, drive a lot of cost overruns, duplicate headcount, and so forth. So that's an important component. And going back to my previous comments around gating items, that's another one that we see quite a few gating items come in that we know that when we put in a new GL system, there will be 3 or 4 boxes that can go away within the organization. And lastly, bringing it all together, that far left wheel, part of the wheel is the culture incentive. So if you have clarity around roles, responsibilities, measurements, it's really what's in it for the employees. It's what's motivating them. And so you have your performance incentives, your path forward to promotion. And it's really aligning those types of incentives and that culture to deliver on the behaviors that you're wanting to motivate. So again, as we call that, it's your overall ways of working. And as you move to the enablers on the right-hand side of the page, it's thinking about how do we facilitate this. And one of the concepts that we use in our process is designing the box versus putting a person in a role. And as you think about designing an organization and what that org chart looks like, it's making sure that those boxes are the right roles, the right levels, and right responsibilities. And almost at the very end of this process is when you drop your names in. That also helps take some of the personal nature out of it. And we have found to be a very good enabler for the org design process. The next couple here are really around alignment and definition. I cover those as far as we went around the wheel here. The location requirements, important in our day and age for a number of reasons. It's the remote working environment that's US based or domestic based versus geo centers and setting up those capabilities internationally. And the last piece is something I really want to drive home here on this slide is this entire process will be facilitated by a number of stakeholders, but it is critical that you set up an internal PMO and change management stakeholder group to really drive this. IPC can help with implementation plans, some of the change management risks, but really having people on the inside to help corral resources, making sure that meetings are getting scheduled, that the CEO checkpoints and steering committee checkpoints. It is critical to have that internal PMO as well as a fulsome change management plan as you're moving towards the integration. So now we're going to talk about the impact point process. And as you look at this slide, again, it's just a reminder that this is a very data and metric driven type of process. And so you see a lot of artifacts, and we do a lot of visualization of those artifacts. I'll cover those in a minute, but you'll see that there are 4 distinct phases to our approach here. So the top blue and light blue bar cover those, and then we have key aspects and frameworks, or those artifacts. So as you're going across the page there, the project setup and the baseline setup, I think, are just 2 critical pieces to absolutely nail that are going to drive the overall success of any design project that you take on. And so the project setup is sort of like the pre-work as you think about the process. And so you're thinking about, how do you fill in those pod participants? What are the principles that you're going to agree to design to? And I'll talk about those more in a minute. The team structure, and again, it's the groundwork for the project. So this is typically pre-sprint engagement. It's the setup. And some of the artifacts, as you look down below, the design principles, these are both qualitative and quantitative type measurements. And so one of them that might be qualitative for you is that we have a matrix organization. We want to make sure that the functional support aligns with the matrix organization. So that is it's almost a binary, but it's a qualitative, that are you meeting the needs? Then you have the quantitative type measurements. These are going to be your span of control needs to be median greater than 6. No manager can be less than 4. No more layers in an organization than X. So you go through and you agree with the steering committee on what those design principles are. And then those really become the guiding principles in what you're trying to design to, and the goal for each of the pods in their design process. The next part down is the team structure. And really, there's 2 artifacts that are important here. It's again, the pod structure with each of those participants, defining their roles, responsibilities, and showing that to them so they understand everybody's aligned on what their role is. And then the back part of that team structure piece is an artifact that gets produced for each of the pods. And it's each of those participants lined out. And so you have the steering committee at the top, and then you'll think about the pod leader, who the designers are, what their role is, what each of the other participants are, the impact point support team, and then other internal as far as the finance business partner, HR business partner. So once you have those principles and team structure set up, you start the baseline setup. And this is taking the HRIS file, the finance information, and developing that single source of truth. And again, single source of truth is critical in these processes because you want it to always be a stagnant comparison as you're doing the design. It can't move over time. So you come up with the org baseline, which is the entirety of the org and the highest level. But you also then go down into each of the organizations and think about what those metrics look like, what those visualizations are, what the addressable population is. And so in that baseline, we have X number of employees at a total loaded headcount cost of Y dollars. You might take out contractors, you might include contractors, interns are probably taken out, but it really comes up with what that addressable piece of the organization is, and then it's your current snapshot. The fact packs below, you can do those for the organization as well as each individual pod. And I pulled some examples out here around spans of control, the layers of the organization, headcount costs. You have levels in there as well as that front graph. These are typically 15 to 20 slides long, and we develop those, and it's the first sprint meeting these get rolled out. So we'll align on those with the pod leader, and then they get rolled out, and it's the baseline, and it's the jumping off point for each sprint. The project delivery is the sprint timing piece of it. And again, as you think about the example I pulled in here, again, is that 12-week type of process. It's broken up into multiple sprints where you're doing design work, then a check-in, design work, and then final. But it lays out the roles, responsibilities, how those come into play, the checkpoints, the timing, and that becomes a part of each sprint meeting. You're showing where you are in that timeline versus the deliverables, and reminds everybody where they are overall in the project. And then again, a tech-enabled design process we do that real time in the sprint process. So out of all the design, the sprints comes the project conclusion. And so that is where you're doing your recommendations to the steering committee and implementation plan. We provide a very detailed list of every single action across all types of moves. So if it's a geocenter relocation, if it's a promotion, reduction, it's laid out by line item, that implementation plan. We then work with each of the pod leaders to come up with the risk and potential mitigation. And that piece is really reviewed with the steering committee to make sure, the steering committee and any people that are impacted, to make sure that we're not breaking anything within the organization. And again, the final piece is that final tally. So it's the change in headcount, the change in roles, responsibilities, and the dollar piece of it. And that is measured against the baseline. And really, HR and finance are the ones that are driving that component of it. So there are a number of levers that you can think about pulling as you think about an org design. This is not meant to be all-encompassing. It's meant to give you some ideas on things that you can address. And there's processes, structure, there's motives that can be looked at as part of the process. And so you'll see a lot of commonality and common themes around optimizations, efficiency, leveling, and realignment. It's just to show you that there are a lot of levers that you can pull. Again, this is not all encompassing. And as we work through each engagement, we come up with what the universe and the recommendations are for those levers. Excuse me. So keys to success. These are keys or lessons learned, if you will. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the top part of this than the bottom. You'll see confidentiality is highlighted both in the lead from the top and leadership accountability. It is critical that these processes are kept confidential. Once they make their way out into the organization, they spread. You have a loss of fidelity, and it becomes problematic. We've even seen some of our clients go so far as to sign NDAs with any of the pod participants. So that is a critical piece here. But I think as you think about the previous slide and has talked about the design principles, it really needs to be led from the top, and that's a combination of the CEO and the steering committee. There has to be alignment in locking those principles down. That's the only way that you're going to be able to minimize exceptions. And this process should be CEO approves exceptions, but they're minimal. It's not a managed by exception type process. And also defining success can be either the CEO or the steering committee. We worked with one CEO who had a very simple definition of success, and that was to achieve the design principles. So I think as you think about that, and then that cascading down to the CEO direct reports, you have to have full buy-in. Every leader must be held to the same standards. You can't have a finance person saying, well, you should go do this, but I'm not going to because it doesn't apply to me. It has to be a full buy-in across the organization. And again, as you go back to my comment about change management, that is where really this comes into play as well, as far as driving that piece of it. Clarity and design principles, we've already talked about the single source of truth, the PMO. And the last piece I want to hit on here is the culture evolution. Again, this is not just a one time and be done with it. This should be your new way of thinking and the new way of operating in an environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jose and have him walk us through recap and then the free org assessment.
Thank you, Greg. So to Greg's point, couple of themes that I want to touch on. Just a quick recap on typical issues that we see in portfolio companies and when something like this makes sense, as well as talk a little bit about the free assessment that we always do as part of these projects. So on the right-hand side here, you're going to see the typical company characteristics that we've seen these projects work well for, and situations as well. So for example, we normally look for companies that have at least 250 employees. I think one couple of good situations also to run a process like this is when a company or a portco has been recently acquired, right? And that is mainly to set it up for growth, or also 18 months prior to exit, right? And in particular, that situation is great when you're trying to make sure you maximize your EBITDA and your enterprise value before the exit. And we recommend 18 months before then. It's a good time to do it. We also have whenever you have an interest in just improving the financial performance of the business. And one place that we've also seen this work quite well is when there's multiple acquisitions, right? So if you think about it with these with these add-ons, a lot of times you add like 2, 3, 4, 5 every year, and all of a sudden you start getting a bit of a mess on your org. So again, whenever you have those situations, this is a great process to run. On the right-hand side, I won't cover all of these. I think Craig has mentioned a few also already, so I'm just going to spend some brief time on the first 4 or 5. But again, the typical issues that are telltale signs that maybe you do want to run a project like this. Whenever you see that there is a lack of role clarity and title alignment in the portcos. Another one that's quite common, you probably see it all the time, is shadow organizations, right? 2 different people doing similar work that should be consolidated, for example. Quite common also to see that there is no standardization of operating model across the business units and operational support. Also, the existence of functional teams within the business units, lack of geocenter alignment. So again, these kind of things are usually telltale signs that maybe you wanna run one of these processes. Let's move on to the next slide, Craig, please. All right, so the free assessment that we talked about. Again, we always like to do this before doing any project because we want to make sure that it's actually our time is going to be well spent and your time is going to be also well spent. We want to make sure that there are significant opportunities for you to run a process like this. And it's pretty simple to do. It doesn't take that long, 2 to 3 weeks. And I'm going to start with what you see on the left-hand side here, what we need from you and what we will do. So 2 things that we need from you. One is your HRIS data sets. Those should be fairly easy to run with your HR department. And then, it's making sure that you have some time to spend in interviews with the IPC team. We don't expect this to be a substantial investment of time, meaning maybe the person that invests the most time, maybe it's 5 hours plus, but not anywhere beyond 10 hours. But I think most people, you can expect them to have 1 or 2 conversations with us to get a sense of a potential opportunities. And then in terms of what Impact Point does with this information, it's obviously we collect and then we start analyzing the data sets. And the first thing that we do is we like to establish a baseline. That baseline might include things like, what is the, what kind of contractors they might have, how do you load for benefits and how do you think about that kind of stuff? What locations are people in? What is your true run rate for the year? How many are open positions versus actual payroll, right? So we make sure that we understand all that piece and have a baseline report for you. And we present that to the executive steering committee. And then finally, we start developing the levers and initial range of potential savings, right? And again, that chart that you see at the bottom, that's the 2 to 3 weeks work, right? Week 1 is mainly going to be some of the setup, coming up with a baseline, reviewing the HRIS data, following up with the teams and doing some of those interviews. Then we move over to the analysis. This is more the, okay, let's start cranking through the levers and the opportunities. And then the last week, finding recommendations, that's going to be some fine tuning and some follow-up conversations with the team. Now, what do you get from these? If you look at the right-hand side here, what you're gonna get from an exercise like this is you're gonna get a baseline data set, and then that baseline is gonna be at the organizational level and at the individual units or departments, for example, right? Or the pods, as Craig called it. So we're gonna find sort of the next level on how to break these down. And we're gonna give you sort of the metrics, right? Where they are in terms of current state around span and layers, geographic mix, seniority, so on and so forth. And then each of those metrics are going to come with potential levers that can be pulled and what is the potential size of those, right? And that's going to be sort of your final report. Something similar. There's going to be a bigger deck with all the different metrics, but you're going to get each opportunity and what kind of levers and the range that we can expect you to save from these. Again, this takes 2 to 3 weeks. It's always a free assessment. And if we align with you on doing a project, we usually like to do it on a base fee plus success fee to make sure that our interests are as aligned as possible. Correct. Can we move on to the next one? Then I won't spend too much time here, but we always like to finish our webinars with information on the next series. So next time we're going to be doing in March a webinar around integrating add-ons. As you know, in many situations with private equity, the portfolio companies accumulate add-ons. And this webinar is going to focus on how to extract synergies, once you've accumulated a few of them and they're starting to become a problem. So we'll send you some of that information in the upcoming weeks. In the last page here, look, that's what we had for you today. Please send us some questions via the chat function, and we'll be happy to respond to those. In addition to that, as you know, we're always happy to help. It doesn't have to be a project. So if you want to reach out and discuss the org assessment or even other things, right? Maybe you're looking for some templates, some playbooks, or just pressure testing ideas, brainstorming with us, always feel free to reach out. We're happy to have those conversations with you.
And I think while we wait for some of the questions to hopefully come through the chat, just to get some people thinking, common questions we might see if Craig and Jose, you guys are okay with answering some. Started off, are there any industries that are better for org design than others?
Jose, you want me to take it or?
Yeah, I think you can start, Craig.
Yeah, I think we've seen it work really well across a number of industries. I think that we did one with SaaS that was very successful. I think as you think about more of the workforce makeup, so there's more, if you think about like a doctor's office or something where there's heavily involved in patient type of work, that's very difficult to go in and scale. If you think about transportation, logistics, those are ones that are difficult to scale. But we found really great success with organizations that have business unit, their substantial back office support function, and overhead piece as well. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I was going to say the same thing, right? When it comes to businesses that are heavily focused on services, and those services or those people are the ones that are generating revenue, that you need to make sure that you have a back office or sort of the admin support functions to be sizable enough to have an impact, because obviously your folks that are generating revenue, that's going to be a tougher thing to extract value from. It's doable. Like if we've had situations where you have logistics companies that you do some routing type of solutions to be able to better serve clients and yet free some of that capacity. But I would say usually that would be a little bit of a constraint, right? Those type of services businesses.
And another thing I think would be important to know is what type of time commitment would be required from executive team and any other participants in this process.
Yeah, that speaks to the sprint methodology that we employ via our approach. And so again, what we have seen is traditionally there was significant working sessions involved in the legacy type of work where you're doing process mapping, you're doing workflows. By employing a data-driven and metric-driven type of approach, we minimize the time commitment. And so if you think about someone who is leading a pod and those pod participants, we typically try to isolate the majority of the work to those sessions. And so if you go back to my comment that we may do twice weekly, hour-and-a-half to 2 hour meetings over that sprint time period, you get to like a 3 or 4 hours a week type of commitment. Obviously, with the steering committee, the CEO, there's going to be reviews with each of the pods, and so there's a little bit more time commitment there. But we have found this to be a very efficient and minimally invasive type of project deployment.
Another good question. What are the kinds of roles that are ideal for moving to geo centers? And kind of on the flip side, are there some roles that should never be moved?
Yeah, I think as you think about sort of a spectrum of highly repetitive to never repetitive type of work, the more something is processing, if it's going through repeating a process over and over, that is the type of role that is ideal for putting into some sort of geo center. As you get to the middle of the spectrum, it becomes a little iffy. And then I think as you think about customer facing, if you have salespeople that are visiting clients, they have to be where those clients are. So that is a never do a geographic. If they're doing outbound calls, maybe that's a different piece of it. But as you think about kind of repetitive nature being the spectrum of what you can outsource to a geo center or what you can't, I think that's probably a good way to think about it. Maggie, I think we're kind of coming up on time, so maybe if we have one more.
Perfect. Yeah. So when we think about the org design process, what time period should we be designing the organization for? So in other words, this design ideally should take us through the next, X number of years. What does that timeline kind of look like?
Yeah, I think that the full org reset, you should really be thinking about a 3 to 5 year strategic plan. We've seen them go longer. And if you remember kind of my comment around the culture of org design being ongoing, you can extend the life of that by tweaking the organization, making sure you're adhering to the design principles and being proactive in that. But as we talk to people, I think it's difficult to see much past that, first of all. But you really want to think about what's your strategy, what's your acquisition, your organic growth, what new products will need to be supported, what business lines. I think if you take a 3 to 5 year view that the organization should be able to support that, that's a very fair and viable way to approach it. So. Well, with that, I think that brings us to time. We certainly appreciate everybody who joined us today. Again, if there's any questions, if you have follow-up on this or any other topic, please reach out to Jose or myself, and we'd be happy to set up some time with you, and would love to do some of the free quick assessments for some of those who joined us as well. So appreciate your time and enjoy your afternoon.